Hi, I'm Jia Sung. I'm a painter and bookmaker. We're in my studio here in New York, and today we'll be going through some basic watercolor techniques as well as how I like to incorporate in my work. I really like watercolor for its immediacy. There's something about how simple it is that feels just really approachable. Water's everything with watercolor, right? It's kind of like the carrier that unlocks everything about watercolor. So we can kind of think about the two techniques we're doing today through this lens of water, right? More water, less control, more control. So a little bit more of a wet on wet approach, right? Like using pigment that's being carried through larger amounts and like swaths of water to create something a little more fluid, gestural, exploratory. And then in using less water, the mark making of watercolor begins to approach drawing a little more. I'm going to start with these tube paints. They're a little wetter, right? They're more liquid. They come in the tubes and you can kind of squeeze them out. I have here like a little, I think it's called like a butcher tray, I believe. And this is just nice because you add so much water to watercolor. It's nice to have a confined, walled container so the water doesn't just run off the side. With watercolor, because of course of the amount of water that you're kind of saturating the paper with, it's important generally, you want to find a little bit of a heavier weight paper. There's a number of options. I call it my Old Faithful. It's just like, I think it's like a Canson paper. So it's like a really nice accessible option and, I just use it for everything. I'm just kind of playing with the shapes I can make on this paper. When you're using a little more water, the paint kind of follows the shape of the water as it dries down. It creates these nice little blossoming shapes, right? They look like little flower edges or like burn marks almost. I love the brevity of Georgia O'Keeffe's watercolors. They feel so unpremeditated, very free. She's kind of carving these big shapes around on the paper. I think they're so interesting, just as an example of something you wouldn't really expect from an artist whose most iconic work are so meticulous, so sort of rigorous. And so you really wouldn't expect that she's also capable of this swooping, exploratory mark. There's really such a light touch. I would say the building block unit of watercolor is really like a wash. If you think about watercolor as just the amount of dilution you're adding to paint and kind of spreading it out across the paper. So a wash could just be as simple as, right, I'm adding a little water to this, like a little orangey color I've got, and right, I'm dragging it out. You can think about that as the foundational building block from which you start to add more vocabulary. So you're kind of playing with this level of transparency over the white of the paper to create the world of your artwork. One neat thing you can do to kind of like flood the large area on the paper at once is to kind of wet down that area and then start to introduce that paint. And so you can see the edges of those brushstrokes get softened out, right? And they start to dissolve just by themselves in that pool of water that I've laid down previously. Of course, there's a limit to how much you can do that, especially on the paper. The more you try to move that around, sometimes the paper actually starts to pill up. And in the worst case scenario, the top layer of it just like rips off and you have a little white hole in your painting. Into this realm of watery paper, you can really start to drop in pigment. There's other colors that can go in. It's also how you can start to build something like a gradient. But you can see, as I drop this lovely red in, there's this beautiful fuzzy blossoming mark that comes out that I think is so nice and is so characteristic of especially the wet on wet approach with watercolor. It feels very dreamlike. I really enjoy this improvisational element of watercolor. A piece I love that really does that well, I think, is Romare Bearden's Brenda. There are large swaths of very wet washes that he's dropping color into, letting it spread out the way it naturally would. And he carves back over that with charcoal of some kind. But he's starting again with this gestural, abstract color field that becomes the home for the figure. What I love about watercolor is that there's so much here that's interesting just in its own right. That has nothing to do with sort of having a trained hand or like, a really virtuosic grasp on the medium. It's nice to see just what the paint wants to do by itself. I think I'm gonna try switch to pans. I'm excited about these colors, to be honest. And the interesting thing about pan paints is that, you could really make your own, right, from two paints. If you just get, the empty pans, you can fill them up and let them dry with two paints. There's really not that much is different about them. The nice thing about these sort of like pan palette format is that they're so portable, right? Because they are essentially the same thing as the two paints, but dried down. As with all watercolor, water's the activator, so I'm really just gonna put some clean water with a clean brush on the paints I'm planning to use. And don't worry if your pan paints have some cracks in them, that's just really normal, and they'll smooth out as you kind of use them. And obviously drop some water on top. So watercolor is so great for observational work because of its portability, and with just a little less water, you can really capture the details of things that you're looking at. In college, I would often take my sketchbooks and a little travel kit of paint just to capture the things I was seeing around me, practice. I love these hyacinths, this ranunculus, I believe it is. I've seen a couple sort of like theme colors here. It's really like yellow, blue that shades into violet of the flowers. There's a wonderful Cézanne landscape watercolor that's in the collection. He uses lots of wonderful dry exploratory marks. You can see there's a little hints throughout the piece where he kind of has a little bit of pencil sketch marks, just to tell him where things are sitting. And even, the first washes that you lay down on the paper is almost like note-taking, right? You're just leaving little notes, sort of like guide points. So I'm just gonna go in and in that spirit, right, make some notes about maybe where these ranunculus are going. With this violet color of the hyacinths, I know that in mixing my colors, I don't really want that to touch the yellow because their complementary colors will start canceling each other a little bit. We get a little bit of a dirty brown. The sort of fresh vibrancy of these flowers is what's important to me about what I'm looking at in front of me. So I think I will lean on maybe more of a predominant blue color, And I think the way this particular paper captures, again, the details of all the little brush strokes is actually kind of nice for painting these flowers, right? I feel like it very gesturally imparts that sense of the little petals kind of like, unfurling and pointing in all their different directions. So I'm just gonna roll with that. So I'm avoiding going full saturation until I kind of finish taking my notes, right? So I'm leaving a little space for that leaf there. Maybe I want a smaller brush. I think I do. I really like leaning into the texture that you can make with brushes. I recently did a series of tarot drawings. I retold the tarot from the Chinese mythological perspective. I think that's really what a lot of my work is about, this kind of like mythological, playful, folklore sort of space. So you'll see mostly square brushes actually in my little collection here, because I actually really like the way that the edge of the brush leaves little scratches and random marks. The rest of my brushes tend to be liner brushes, so something finer. I like to come back in and after I make the initial sort of like larger sweeps and add a little line work. I sometimes do that with ballpoint pens as well, depends on what I'm working on. I'm starting to sketch in these stems here. Not at the full final saturation that I'm hoping for, but just kind of using the same color family basically to sketch in these shapes before I commit to them, right? A little darker, a little more saturated. Oh, and I love that little bud that's peeping around. I tried to keep some of these smaller, not yet bloomed pieces of vegetation. It's hard with plants, right? Like they're so detailed, the way they overlap and interweave, I think is what is so beautiful and charming about them. But I think you could really get sucked into, wanting to reproduce that faithfully. So I try to go for maybe almost more the gesture of that. I'm translating that lovely purple through this ultramarine. So I'm just gonna go in with that and start pulling out a few of these flowers. I love seeing this like drier, brushier technique. I think that Cézanne piece is so interesting. He's pulling out little details, right, like little trees, and yet the whole thing stays quite loose, I think there's a really lovely, lyrical, it almost begins to look like music notation to me at some points. I'm hoping to channel a little of that in how I am dealing with these hyacinths. I want to bring a little detail in there, but I don't want to get too precious. So I think there is something a little slower about something observational like this, perhaps, because I'm sort of building up a little more carefully, around these shapes. Something about the still life, I think artists just keep coming back to it because it is relaxing. It's like going to a spa for your art brain. It's like, no questions today, no thoughts, I'm just painting flowers. Please don't ask me anything. I mean, even, the gradients of this plant are helping me inform the decisions I make to paint. I can see that on this leaf, for example, right, it's a little yellower near the stem. And it's almost its most dark and saturated green right near the tip. I was actually just thinking about how like such a big tell of this drier approach is the way the marks interact. Sort of like an optical mixing, right? Of like one veil of color over another. The edges are much crisper. I think in that way it can be a little less forgiving than this blobbier, wetter approach where everything is just like an interesting texture. Talking about negative space, right? Maybe I'll try to carve around some of these hyacinths that I've painted previously. I am a fan of the white of paper. To me, it especially recalls traditions of Chinese ink painting, for example, where the white of paper is such a space for like breathing room. I'm gonna knock in this vase just because it's such a big shape to me in this still life setup. And I think it will really help anchor our whole composition on the page. Yeah, I think it's a great place for some wet on wet. Just happens to mimic that texture really nicely. The water's kind of pooling at the bottom of the page a little, but that's okay. I like that. I might even like exaggerate some of this texture because it kind of looks like that vase to me. I think now these big yellow baubles of the ranunculus are drier. I want to go back in and just add a little bit of visual interest by describing some of that shift in value. So I'm gonna get a smaller brush. Right, so a related color to this sort of pure yellow, but just a little darker. And because this previous really aggressive blob of yellow I placed on here is now dry, I get to have a little more control in the way I place these marks down, right? You can see it's a little cleaner, it's more drawing-like. I'm kind of thinking about the way that O'Keeffe brings some smaller, finer marks into the piece, almost to improve its legibility. You can think about the different sizes of marks in a piece as well as like a source of interesting visual tension. For example, the train is distilled down to this very geometric swooping triangle. It looks like in a slightly drier watercolor, almost like a drawing mark again. I loved the Marlene Dumas portraits forever, and she's really doing something quite similar there. These larger sort of areas of wash that she then goes back into and creates some detail and tension again, bring those human features into these otherwise quite ambiguous blobs. Maybe I'll do a little bit of the same thing to the hyacinths actually, because now I see this, I feel like that's missing a little bit of that. I want a little bit of a unifying hand almost. Again, not super worried about detail, almost like unfocusing my eyes, right? And just kind of going for a general sense of what's in front of me. And in some cases, actually just reinforcing, going over what's already there, right? Like that first wash that I did to block out where I envisioned the shapes going was also very, very light because it was tentative, right? I wanted the option to kind of like maybe correct or, choose what to emphasize later. Now that it's a little more clear to me what's happening on the page, it's easier for me to make that call. If I'm looking at what's in front of me, I guess we have the table. It could be interesting, we could try it. Perhaps even just as a big geometric shape. Could be an interesting element that helps us feel a little more resolved and like considered. I think a pretty thin wash of it would be nice. I like that. It's also the only like really reddish thing that's in this composition, which I don't know about you, but I feel like I was missing that a little bit, right? We have a lot of blue and yellow predominating. I'm not so much interested in recreating the exact color of the wood as just like, again, what it does like saturation-wise, right, for this composition. And, I normally love these little puddles, right, and the way the watercolor pools, but in that case, I thought it was perhaps a little distracting, so I just evened it out with the brush, right? Yeah, I like that. I feel like that helps a lot, actually. I would, maybe start to keep bringing in areas of more shadow, more saturation, right? Building up in these thin, drier layers, some areas of more detail and smaller shapes throughout. But I'm pretty happy with this. I think that all the sort of larger elements that I need are kind of in place, and it's really just about finessing and futzing around with it a little bit. There are so many ways that artists have kind of used the medium of watercolor. So I really encourage you to go out and play as well with the amount of options that are open to you. Paper, brushes, type of paint can all really inform what the final product is. I think that's the beauty of watercolor. It's such an open medium. It's really just about giving yourself that space to play.